Welcome to Open Inquiry Week at the University of Michigan, where we invite students, faculty, and staff to consider what does it mean to explore ideas with curiosity and courage, even when those ideas are unpopular or flawed. Open inquiry has long been a value at Michigan. It's not just about protecting free expression, it's about preparing students to be both critical thinkers and empathetic citizens. We want students to leave Michigan with the ability to test ideas rigorously, engage differences honestly, and practice the courage it takes to speak, as our guest, Professor Loury, will point out, as well as the courage it takes to listen. In February, Provost Macaulay commissioned a task force that I led. Our mission is to foster a culture of open inquiry. The university is at its best when we have more curiosity and less condemnation, more courage and less conformity. We created an online module for all incoming undergraduates at the Ann Arbor campus this fall, preparing them to thrive in an environment where Wolverines don't all think alike. We call it Talking Maize and Blue to draw on school spirit. Among other things, it introduced the Michigan Pause, a technique to help students have challenging conversations to make disagreements be productive rather than polarizing. You're all welcome to try out the online module. There are cards with QR code where you can pick one up at the table afterwards. It includes a fun quiz game where you get to predict what the students think about some not so serious questions like does pineapple belong on pizza, and some more serious questions like should hate speech be censored. Throughout the year, you can find events with the open inquiry hashtag on happenings at Michigan. On the other side of the card is a QR code that will take you to the page for that. Some of the people organizing those events are here and staffing tables. I encourage you to check out what they're up to after today's event. So today's event is the first in a series titled How to Speak Your Mind, How to Change Your Mind, that explores how to develop an informed opinion and stand firm when challenged, and equally important, when to change your mind in light of new evidence, different perspectives, and serious reflection. With that theme, we found it particularly fitting to have Glenn Loury as our inaugural speaker for this series. He spent a lifetime expressing and defending unpopular political and intellectual views within academic and policy settings. And he's changed his mind about important issues many times, and quite publicly. His new book, Self-Censorship, discusses why it's so difficult for us to express opinions that run counter to the group norms. He provides a model for thinking about why it's a rational equilibrium, but not a good one, for sympathetic critiques to go unspoken. The book will be available for purchase during the reception, and I hope you'll check that out. Before formally introducing Professor Dillard, who's going to interview Professor Loury, let me thank the many campus organizations that co-sponsored this event: the Life-Changing Education Theme Year, the Program on Intergroup Relations, the University of Michigan Library, Heterodox Academy Campus Community, the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, and the Office of the Provost. So, Glenn C. Loury is the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences Emeritus at Brown University. As an academic economist, he's published widely in the general area of applied microeconomic theory. He's been elected as a Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association, a Fellow of the Econometric Society, and a member of the American Philosophical Society, among other honors. As a public intellectual, writing mainly on the themes of racial inequality and social policy, he's published hundreds of essays and reviews in journals of public affairs in the US and abroad. He's also host of The Glenn Show, a popular podcast and newsletter, and the author of the widely read memoir, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative. His most recent book is Self-Censorship, just published by Polity Books. Angela D. Dillard is the Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and is currently serving also as the Interim Vice Provost for Access and Opportunity. Across the two, she works with multiple teams of faculty and professional staff to center the goals of educational access and to ensure that we're doing all we can to lower the institutional barriers to achievement for all students. She's specially charged with bringing aspects of the National Student Academic Success Movement to Michigan and is responsible for advancing continual improvements in the educational experience for more than 34,000 undergraduate students in partnership with the undergraduate serving schools and colleges on the Ann Arbor campus. As a member of the UM faculty, Dr. Dillard is the Richard A. Meisler Collegiate Professor of Afro-American and African Studies and History. As an interdisciplinary scholar trained in history and political theory, she specializes in American and African American intellectual history with a focus on issues of race, religion, and politics on both the left and the right. She's currently working on her third book titled Different Shades of Freedom, which investigates the sometimes surprising intersections between the post-World War II civil rights movement and the rise of the new right. Please join me in welcoming Professor Loury and Professor Dillard.
So welcome back to Michigan, Professor Loury, and my thanks as well for being with us this evening. We're just going to do a quick mic check with each other. Is that levels okay?
Yeah, levels
Volume
great.
Okay? Okay, we were both having a little bit of, we were behind Paul, so we were having a little bit of.
I didn't understand a word Paul said.
Yeah, well, it was all good. I was monitoring him as he moved through. So let's jump right in. For those who haven't yet had the opportunity to read the book or the 1994 essay that's contained inside of it, I think it's good to start with a conceptual overview of self-censorship as an idea and then work into some specifics. So self-censorship is about restraining one's own ideas, opinions, or speech out of a concern for the potential negative social, professional, or political consequences. It's when we consciously withhold our true opinions on controversial issues due to social pressure in positive ways out of a desire for belonging and to be in community, and in negative ways because we fear condemnation, such as losing friends, facing professional repercussions, being ostracized or labeled with negative terms such as racist, sexist, bigot, commie, anti-Semite. One of the first important distinctions that you draw is between the quasi-voluntary self-silencing and the conditions under which one might be silenced by government or institutional censorship, which in some ways is a more familiar, right, to us. In the first instance, it's social pressure that's doing the work. In the second, it's the state apparatus, laws, courts, policies that limit speech through the threat of legal sanction. In your essay, in your book, you encourage us to be more attentive to what you call, quote, the velvet glove of social co-optation, as opposed to, quote, the iron fist of state repression. You draw insights from Mill, who expresses a similar set of ideas on liberty. And you name this, and I think this is really important, as an ancient dilemma, right? Not as a kind of contemporary thing, but as an ancient dilemma for public and political speech, because, as you note, apostates and heretics are unwelcome within the council of the faithful. We want to be esteemed insiders. We don't want to be despised outsiders. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's pretty good. I mean, the problem is that when you speak, people make inferences about the things about you which are not directly visible, but about which they have concerns. They're concerned about, are you a true believer? Are you on the right side of history? Do you share our values? Are you faithful to our tenets? Within a given community, there will be a concern to police community members around fidelity to commonly shared values. And inferences from speech that bear on people's conclusions about your values are the inferences that I'm most concerned about. And a desire to stay within community, to not be shunned, to not be ostracized, to be invited to dinner, to be included within the councils of the faithful, inclines people to be strategic in how they express themselves. There's no such thing, I'm an economist, but there's no free speech. I mean, speech is costly even if there's no law prohibiting what you say, because people, when they hear you say it, draw conclusions about the speaker based upon your willingness to say whatever it is that might be controversial or outside of the agreed upon consensus. So that's the phenomenon that I'm trying to identify and analyze in the essay.
Yeah, I think it's really, so this idea that there's no free speech, right? That speech always has a cost or a consequence, or free in the sense that there's always the context brought to bear, right? So it's not free of context, it's not free in some cases of consequences, especially if what you have to say is broadly unpopular, and that there's a high social cost, right, for articulating views that are at variance, right, with your community, your institution, your tribe, your nation, whatever it might be. But don't we all self-censor? I mean, like the concept of civility, right? It sort of implies some self-censorship, keeping the peace within a family,
Sure.
Not contradicting your boss at work, right? I feel like I self-censor a lot to, keep the job that I have, just in kind of casual ways, right? I mean, it's not that I feel like my free speech rights are being impinged on, but it seems, I don't know, prudent.
Well, of course. I mean, we have a sense of comportment, of a kind of concern for the sensibilities of others. We would edit or censor ourselves in discussing a lot of content that might be embarrassing to people. Etiquette, sure. But there are going to be things that are really important where the same kinds of pressures will cause the character of the public discourse to be significantly attenuated, to be stifled. People are afraid to speak against going to war in a time when all of the forces of consensus and opinion making are urging that we go to war. Criticism of our leadership, of our party or our group, when there are enemies on the outside who would voice the same criticism. Our willingness to engage in that criticism could be seen as injurious to the cause, things of that kind. And that's where I'm most concerned. I'm most concerned about the absence of effective public criticism causing outcomes that are deleterious and avoidable, but that are nevertheless engendered because there's a blanket over the collective deliberation that allows for bad ideas to get the floor. And people who don't share those ideas fear to voice their disagreement because they want to avoid the social opprobrium associated with doing so.
Yeah, I thought that this was a really important part of your argument, and I think we'll try and come back around on this a couple of times. I mean, this idea that the personal cost of speaking can be quite high under certain conditions, but that you suggest that the social cost of people not speaking is in some degrees higher, right? It's the not speaking that might also have a cost that we want to attend to, and that excessive self-silencing, you argue, results in an impoverished public discourse and the breakdown of honest communication. I think it's a really kind of interesting point to underscore a little bit. And
Yeah.
I really appreciated that there's a cost both ways. I thought was a really intriguing idea. I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, or
No.
to kind of close out the sort of overview of the concept. Or just shift to the stuff about the 1990s, that in the context for you that produced the essay.
Well, let me say this. If we don't hear from our fellows honest reports about what they think on sensitive matters, we don't really know where we stand. And you can easily envision a stable situation in which there is large-scale agreement underground about an issue, but no one is certain that they're not the only one or one of the few who hold the view. And because there's this conspiracy of silence, the deliberation gets stymied. This is the emperor has no clothes problem. And that kind of a situation interests me because it may not be stable, and it gives rise to the possibility of abrupt and discontinuous shifts in opinion as what had heretofore been unspeakable suddenly becomes commonly spoken, and the pent-up resentment at being prohibited from expressing one's view takes an ugly and reactionary character. I think we're living through such a time. I interpret some of the backlash against DEI, for example, as a culmination of a sense of the unraveling of what had heretofore been a tacit agreement not to voice certain kinds of criticisms or misgivings. These are, of course, sensitive and subtle issues that I'm talking about, but as a broad characterization, I'm saying a lot of people had a lot of questions in their minds about some of the diversity enthusiasms and initiatives. But of course, in polite company and respectable progressive community, it was not speakable to voice those views. They felt they were being treated unfairly, but they felt they couldn't say that they thought that they were being treated unfairly because they didn't know if they would be the only one giving voice to such a thought crime. And so the situation sat there ready for a demagogue to come along, somebody who rips the cover off of the thing and is not afraid of being called a racist or whatever, who then fuels this upsurge of sentiment that has a dynamic that can overshoot. And we end up, again, where I think we are, with not only the Supreme Court saying you can't do racial affirmative action and be consistent with the 14th Amendment, but with people saying you can't talk about Black history without being unfair to white people, which, of course, is kind of an absurd and reactionary position to be in, but I'm arguing one can understand it as the logical endpoint of a kind of dynamic of resentment and retribution and so on that got its start, in part, with the impetus of self-censorship and political correctness. Just a thought.
Good segue, because we're going to go back to the early 1990s. In the early 1990s, you linked the high cost of unpopular speech to political correctness and the culture wars, what we might today call cancel culture, especially in universities and the media. You write about it as a time when liberal activists made their own opinions, particularly those having to do with race and gender, into an orthodoxy from which heretics dissented at their own peril. And here you draw on some of your own experiences as a social critic, speaking from a center-to-right political perspective. And in the 1994 essay, people here who've read that and the people joining us on the live stream will note that it was about issues like affirmative action, divestment from South Africa, date rape and sexual harassment, as well as conditions of the Black urban poor, about which you were writing extensively and publicly at that time. I remember it as a time in which lots of people yelled at great length and volume about being silenced, and in which the claim to silencing was used as a political cudgel in its own right? I'm being silenced, therefore I get to beat you about the head. We would disagree on some of those issues. But I think so one question I have about this, other than just having you talk about your own experiences in this moment, might be something like, where does my attempt to hold you accountable for the legitimacy of your own views lapse into political correctness, or what might be judged as an attempt to inappropriately police your thoughts. Right, so, I mean, if we could kind of just sort of think a little bit about the moment of the 1990s, lots of yelling kind of across the political divide, lots of accusations, lots of claims to being silenced. Again, some of them loud, some of them not loud, in all fairness. But with a side that said, I'm not being politically correct. I'm just trying to hold people accountable for what they're saying. I mean, so I'm just wondering, so you're sitting in the midst of all of this, and that this is the essay, right, that this is the way that you make sense of what was such a fraught political moment. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to it, what that's like, kind of how you think back on that moment.
I've been working on that piece for a decade. It really started with me trying to give voice to my dissent on the civil rights arguments in the early mid-1980s. I was on the faculty here at Michigan from 1978 to 1982. I was teaching at Northwestern and took a sabbatical semester in '78, and my late wife, Linda Datcher Loury, the economist, we met in graduate school at MIT, and she'd taken a job here at Michigan, and we wanted to get together, so I moved, accepted the offer at Michigan. I moved to the Department of Economics in 1979. And I was looking at Detroit. And Detroit was going to hell in a handbasket. It was dangerous, it was poorly governed, it was out of hand. And I was saying, look, this is not a civil rights question. This is not an issue of enough anti-discrimination legislation. This is a complicated question, of course, and I'm not going to claim to have understood it, but I thought that coming to terms with the reality of the dysfunction within the society was an important part of coming to grips with the problem, and it wasn't being talked about. And I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to talk about the Moynihan Report from the mid-1960s about the state of the black family. I wanted to talk about violence, criminal violence, and what had to be done to maintain order, about the importance of maintaining order, and so on. I want to talk about responsibility, personal responsibility, raise your children, and so forth. That's how I wanted to talk. But nobody wanted to hear a black guy talking like that, and this is important. I mean, if I had been your run-of-the-mill white guy, I would just be another Republican or another conservative, but a black guy. Now I'm betraying my own people. So the offer comes to move to Harvard in 1982, and I go to Harvard, and I get a bigger platform. I have more cachet, and I begin to make these arguments in magazines that are like the New Republic and Commentary and so on. And a ton of bricks is falling on me, and people are calling me names, and they're disinheriting me, so to speak. They're shunning me. And I had to process that. Of course, I processed it as me being the hero of the plot and them all having it in for me because I had the courage to tell the truth. Not me being held accountable because a responsible public intellectual understands that these subtle and complicated questions, when voiced within an environment of political complexity, requires judgment and prudence, and you don't say everything you think, and you watch where and how you say it, and you look at who you associate with, and don't let them use you. Don't let them put you up as the black face to give credence and legitimacy, all of those concerns, which are legitimate concerns. They didn't occur to me. I was just the victim of the incumbent established order wanting to close ranks around a erroneous consensus about the problem. And that's what got me to thinking in the terms that ended up finally with the urging and support and advice of my dear friend, the late, great Thomas Schelling, the economist whom I was colleagues with at Harvard at the Kennedy School. He said, you have to write this down. You have to think this through and you have to write it down. He helped me to see that at the core of my concern was a signaling argument. This is actions that people can observe, which give them information about things that they care about, which they can't observe. That's a signal. And you got to get the incentives right. The information has to line up with the incentives in such a way that the inferences that people draw from observing the action actually are, on average, correct about the things that they can't observe. I know that that was a little bit obscure, what I just said, but if you read the essay, I think you'll see my point. And Tom said, you have to write this down, and I eventually did get it written down, and James Coleman, the late, great sociologist at Chicago who was publishing Rationality and Society, the journal where this article appeared, said, this is terrific, we want to publish it, and that's how the essay came to be. But I was on a tear, and there was a certain amount of self-pity and a certain amount of self-aggrandizement that was involved in it, because, as I say, I didn't take on board fully the responsible discourse is not simply saying everything that you think might be true that's on your mind. It's managing your presentation in a way that is, I think, consistent with a wiser assessment of what's the political landscape is that you're operating in right now. Something like that. Something like that.
Yeah. I have two follow-ups. One is, was there a certain amount of joy in this heretic status? I mean, you seem to be kind of enjoying it. Right.
So I tell this story in my memoir. The late, everybody's the late. I just enjoyed my 77th birthday, so it's kind of like that. Economist Phyllis Wallace is her name, who was a mentor of mine when I was in graduate school. An African-American woman, as it happened, a Yale PhD, and worked with Kenneth Clark in New York on the Metropolitan Applied Research Center research that resulted in the great book, Dark Ghetto, and was research director at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the 1960s when it first was getting started. Phyllis Wallace, a wonderful person who should be remembered. At the time, this was 1984, she was involved with the Civil Rights Coalition, leaders of the NAACP and the Urban League and the Joint Center for Political Study and other civil rights organizations. And they had group meetings. They'd get together every now and then, twice a year, I think, and compare notes. And she invited me to come and address this gathering. Coretta Scott King was amongst the people representing the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and of course representing the legacy of her late husband. Was attending this meeting along with the people who I could name, you wouldn't know who they are, but leaders of these organizations. So I had the floor for 30 minutes, and then there was 30 minutes of Q&A. I was on the agenda, and I went to this meeting, and I basically gave a kind of speech like the one that I previewed earlier in this gathering about how I thought the civil rights movement was over. That was my lead argument. The civil rights, there's a bunch of civil rights leaders sitting around. It's 1984, Ronald Reagan is running for re-election, and he's getting ready to win in a landslide over Walter Mondale. It's dark days for the progressives, okay? And here's this I was young in 1984. Harvard, first black with tenure in the economics department. I'm kind of this iconic person. And this is what I'm saying. And they had at me, man. Coretta didn't say very much, but tears rolled down her eyes. And I described this scene poignantly in my book because it was a moment. And it should have been, I'm saying all this to say, chest thumping, and I'm going to speak the truth no matter what, is a little bit sophomoric. And it's just not good enough, which is not a defense of political correctness, but it's a call to responsible and prudent exercise of the privilege of having a megaphone to be able to address yourself to public issues. And I think that needs to be said.
So one of the things you write about in the essay, and one of the things I remember, from the 1990s, sort of watching. So you write about people who substitute ad hominem attack for actual arguments, right? Where it just becomes character assassination and name calling, as opposed to real engagement, like a real argument over public policy or what you really think about the Black urban poor. And you say that this is one of the contributing factors to self-censorship. You can't keep going, right, if all the attacks are so negative, right, and so based in character and not in actual argument, which I think is a really interesting thing that you touch on. Do you recall that time as were there people who you thought really did a good job of engaging you on the level of the argument, intellectually, politically?
Some of my colleagues at Harvard, this is in the 1980s, like Orlando Patterson, the sociologist, Nathan Huggins, the late historian who was chair of Afro at Harvard for a while, the young Randall Kennedy, he was young then, Randall Kennedy at the law school, Christopher Edley at the law school. These are people that I could talk with. But not so much Derek Bell, although I, in retrospect, have come to appreciate him more perhaps than I did at the time.
Huge fan.
Martin Kilson, the late Martin Kilson, called me, what did he call me? Pathetic black mascot of the right. Now, that was ad hominem, wasn't it? That was not engaging my arguments.
I think that counts.
He thought they were beneath contempt, not worthy of being engaged in a serious manner. And I was writing in Martin Peretz's New Republic, which was verboten. For these guys, that was a sin. So I forgot your question, Angela.
Just about, so you write so wonderfully about this problem of ad hominem attack, which I think we ought to consider sort of beneath us.
Well, calling somebody an Uncle Tom is not really an effort of persuasion, is it?
No. So, but I was curious about whether or not, even in this time where, you write about political correctness being this big problem, and it seems to be propelling ad hominem attacks, right, against heretics, against orthodoxy. So I was just curious about your experiences with people who did it well in engaging you.
Who did what well?
Who actually engaged your ideas and really argued with you, kind of could go toe-to-toe.
Yeah, well, I mentioned some of them.
That was the question.
Yeah, I mentioned some of them.
Yes.
A little bit later, this is into the 90s, I took up conversations with people like the young Peter Beinart, who was editor at the New Republic for a while. He kept saying to me, well, if these black politicians are so bad, why are they so successful at the polls? And, if your arguments are so compelling, why don't they persuade the rank and file opinion and so on? There were others, but I drifted right.
So you drifted right and then had, some once again, maybe, some problems with an orthodoxy of the right, some constraints. You had a public falling out with conservative author Dinesh D'Souza in 1995 over his book, The End of Racism, which you sharply criticized as vicious and contemptuous, leading to your resignation from the conservative American Enterprise Institute in protest over that publication. Could someone have accused you of political correctness for, rightly, in my mind, taking D'Souza to task for his opinions?
I'm sorry, did they criticize me for taking D'Souza to task?
Could someone have said to you that you're engaging in a form of political
Oh, was
correctness
that not doing to
in
him
your
what
critique?
I objected to people
Yes.
doing to me? He would say so, I'm sure, but that book was ridiculous.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
You have to read this book, The End of Racism. I'm not going to recapitulate the book here, but I thought it was an affront to serious reflection, and I was very annoyed with the American Enterprise Institute, where Christopher DeMuth was president at that time, for platforming this kind of thing and putting a lot of money behind it. He wasn't a scholar, he was a polemicist, and he was poking fun at, if you will, my people. And it wasn't a serious analysis, and I objected, and I wrote a scathing review that was published in the Weekly Standard. Bill Crystal was editor-in-chief at the Weekly Standard. At the time, John Podhoretz was the guy who handled my manuscript at the Weekly Standard. And I said, look, I actually agree with Thomas Sowell about affirmative action and stuff. Thomas Sowell, the conservative economist whom D'Souza leans on and borrows from. I'm a relatively conservative guy studying the race questions in America, but this is beyond the pale. And I mean, you can decide if you read the review. I think the review actually engages the book, but it does so with a sneer, because that book really pissed me off. There were other books that also came out roughly in that time. The Bell Curve came out in 1994. Abigail and Stephen Thernstrom's America in Black and White came out in 1997, if I'm not mistaken. I wrote a long and very critical review of the Thernstrom's book in The Atlantic. I wrote a number of critical essays of the Bell Curve, very much in the spirit of the progressive reaction to the Bell Curve at the time, which was thinly veiled, accusing them of racism by raising the question of race and IQ in the way that they did, which is not all or even mainly what that book is about, but it's neither here nor there. But I've since come to think a little bit more kindly toward, Herrnstein died before the book could appear, but toward Murray's effort. I don't agree with the Southern Poverty Law Center that Charles Murray is an unreconstructed racist. I think he's a guy who is not a genetic specialist, but who is a popular social science writer with great talent and insight. I mean, he's produced books since then that I think are noteworthy. And I think the idea that you would want to shut down inquiry about intelligence as a general social phenomenon and about the biogenetic foundations for intelligence, if any, that you'd want to shut down inquiry is a greater threat to our intellectual integrity than is the speculation along those lines, which may or may not be borne out by the facts. So I think differently about the Bell Curve now than I did in the 1990s. But I started thinking the guys and women, but they were mostly guys whom I was affiliated with at the American Enterprise Institute in like places and around these magazines like Commentary and the Weekly Standard and whatnot, didn't really care about the people that I cared about. That there was a kind of indifference and maybe even thinly veiled contempt. And I had to ask myself, who was I in bed with and where was I going? And that was the beginning of a period in my life when I started shifting away from the right. Cast Out by the Right is the title to a piece that I put in the New York Times opinion pages in those years because they were happy to have me. David Horowitz, the late David Horowitz, arch-conservative, notorious figure, was happy to have me. He and Collier had this project called Second Thoughts. These were 60s radicals who were rethinking all of their lefty ideas. And they had a book, in effect, I don't think this is the title, but the effect of the book was Second Thoughts on Race. And I was right there, and, and early in the pages of that collection of essays, giving voice to my heretical views about race. And they were happy to have me when I was, back in their play. I was the black guy saying the stuff that they wanted to hear. And when I started having second thoughts about my second thoughts, they were less interested in hearing from me. But long story.
Yeah, no, but a good story. And at some point it might be nice to come back to the ideas about the books from that era, which, I remember quite well. And I remember a certain amount of frustration because it was so hard at some point to argue against them. So it was so hard, this idea, right, that good arguments will chase out bad arguments. Good scholarship will chase out bad scholarship. Good ideas will chase out bad ideas. Good money chases out bad money, right, for the economists. And how difficult in that moment it was to see that operationalized. That stuff was enormously difficult to argue against. And I remember a lot of people feeling kind of just shut out of a political and discursive universe because you just couldn't find a purchase to argue about all of these books that were starting to kind of, build the same sort of ideological case.
And that was 30 years ago.
That was 30 years ago.
So where are we now?
Nice segue, because that's exactly where we're going, right? So, what I really love about this volume is that it takes the 1994 essay, which a young Angela was, really quite taken with, and then pairs it with your thoughts, especially from 2024, 2023, 2024. So you add in afterwards called Self-Censorship in a Time of War, in which you're courageous enough to talk about Gaza and the Israeli-Hamas war. And I'd like to read a passage. And I was saying earlier that one of the nice things about this volume is that the writing is really beautiful, I think, in a lot of passages. So it's 2024, and you've been invited to give a talk on Black-Jewish relations at a synagogue in Palm Beach. You weren't invited to address the war, but it was on your mind, you say. The reports of the dead, the grotesque images, and the terrifying accounts of the refugees weighed heavily on me. In the months since Hamas's brutal attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023, the death toll in Gaza had been mounting at a dizzying pace. The United States had, in short order, affirmed its support for Israel and was supplying a steady flow of weapons and money, paying only lip service to what I was beginning to view, what I could not help but view as a humanitarian disaster, not because of the dead Hamas militants and their political leadership, who all knew what they had been signing up for, but because of the dead women, children, and elderly people, because of the dead medics and journalists. The news of dire food shortages in Gaza chilled me, as did images of block after block of bombed-out ruins that had once housed apartments, schools, and businesses. Skipping a little bit, what was being done in Gaza, if arguably necessary from Israel's point of view, nevertheless amounted to a set of horrific deeds with which I was loath to see my own country associated. Skipping a bit again, when I hinted publicly at my growing doubts about Israel's actions in Gaza, I received immediate blowback. Friends and strangers alike were emailing me long missives, taking me to task for my historical ignorance, listing figures about acceptable civilian to combatant death ratios, and reiterating Israel's embattled regional position. The common refrain that emerged among ardently pro-Israel politicians, media figures, spokesmen, and others was this: to suggest that Israel was killing too many civilians amounted to a betrayal of the Jewish people. I chafed at this idea. I knew I am not an anti-Semite, but it soon became clear to me that giving voice to my misgivings about Israel's conduct of this war risked having me labeled as one. Still, you're right, this was an urgent matter for Gazans and Israelis, yes, but also in a different way for us Americans. The U.S. logistical and diplomatic support for the war was a point of heated conflict on college campuses such as Brown, where I teach. The pro-Palestinian side did have its excesses, and true, some anti-Semites were taking advantage of it, but that did not negate for me the moral and prudential core of the arguments for a ceasefire, coupled with the release of Israeli hostages. And then you're right, I chose not to raise the subject of the war at all at that synagogue. You say not out of politeness, but that you were afraid of what it might mean to take an explicit, full-throated position critical of Israel's military response, and what it would do to your reputation. Can you talk a little bit about that moment? I mean, I thought this was a very effective passage, where I really felt like, as is often the case in this, where you feel like there is a mind at work on the page and behind these kinds of ideas. Well,
I mean, you did a good job quoting from the book, the setup of the situation. I had developed a relationship with some people affiliated with the synagogue who had an endowed speaking series, and they invited me to come and talk about Black-Jewish relations, and I had a set of remarks that I could make about affirmative action and about the historic relationship and how it has been under pressure and whatnot for decades, going all the way back to the 1960s and so on. And I gave those remarks. I gave the remarks that I had prepared, and I didn't seize the opportunity to engage in dialogue, given the concerns and misgivings about Israel's prosecution of the war in Gaza that you've described. I didn't bring it up. I choked. It was going to be difficult. I was going to piss some people off. There were going to be consequences. There have been consequences. Did I know enough about all of the ins and outs of what happened at Camp David and what happened in 1948 and what happened in 1967 and what happened in 1929? No, I didn't. I haven't spent my life studying the issue. How dare I arrogate to myself the presumption to a welcoming Jewish audience of opining about such matters from my condition of ignorance, I thought. Don't you know this is life and death? Easy for you to sit back on your high horse and pontificate. Did you see what happened on October 7th? I anticipated these kinds of rebuttals. And so I did what I analyzed the consequences of social pressures to conform and not give voice to your real thoughts because you don't want to be ostracized. I did that very thing. So as I was framing this essay for republication and looking for a way of making the current presentation of the text more compelling to people, I thought I should tell that story. I experienced the very phenomenon that I'm trying to analyze here. Now, I can't talk about not talking about it without talking about it. So I'm out of the closet, so to speak. No offense meant to my gay friends. You know, now I have to answer questions like, well, what would you have Israel do? Frankly, I don't have an answer to that question. My concern is about what the United States of America does. But this line of thought, which began actually for me when I read Ta-Nehisi Coates' collection of essays, The Message, one piece within which it's a collection of 4 or 5 pieces. This is the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. And I've been critical of Ta-Nehisi's work in the past. I didn't much care for his best-selling blockbuster, Between the World and Me, but that's another conversation. But he had an essay where he talked not about Gaza, he talked about going on an excursion to the West Bank and observing what he saw to be apartheid state. That's the words that he uses. And I read that essay in which he foregrounds the humanity of the Palestinians and the weight of the occupation that weighs on them in the occupied territories. And I thought there was merit in that piece of writing. I actually admired, and I was a little bit chastened by it because he was speaking out in his register from his point of view. His mouth is not a prayer book. He doesn't have to be right about everything that he's saying, but he's engaging it. And I felt, you know, you're African-American intellectual. This is not a question about race, but it is a question about social responsibility, and it's a question about telling such truths as you may be given to know, about giving voice to such critical reflections as you may be inclined to give, about engagement. And I thought I really had a responsibility not to make this my thing, but to not avoid it either. And so I have done, and so this book gives some evidence of, but it has been a source of much conflict and consternation in my life, and I accept that.
You know, Gaza and speech deemed to be too pro-Palestinian, I think presents us with a really powerful confluence of state and institutional censorship on the one hand, and the self-censorship that keeps many of us cowed and quiet about the issue. I mean, I think a lot of us just do not speak on this issue, even though we kind of think we exercise free and critical speech on a range of other kinds of things, right? I mean, this one really, I think, keeps us quiet. And you say that you really regretted the moment at the synagogue, right? That you've come to regret that. But in speaking about it and in publishing it here, I mean, you've also had to experience what happens, right, when you do express a view that's, you know, at variance, right? And so that once again, you've been living through a kind of moment of blowback, right, because of some of the choices that you're making around, you know, these questions of when to speak, how to speak, you know, under what kinds of contexts. In fact, I read that you parted ways, I love that phrase, with a Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank that hosted your podcast, The Glenn Show, which is great, by the way. I can really recommend it, over your criticisms of the Israeli state and their conduct in Gaza. Right? So that there have been personal, professional consequences for having done this.
The Manhattan Institute cut me loose. My friend Raihan Salam sent me a terse note saying we examine our fellowship associations from time to time for productivity and shared value commitments, and we think it's time to discontinue our relationship. My productivity hasn't been flagging. I've been putting out, memoirs and essays and whatnot, webinars and stuff at MI, so I have to assume that it was shared values, and the values in question certainly are not what to do about public housing or law enforcement in New York City, where we are pretty much mutually on the same page. So by a process of elimination, I conclude that inviting Omer Bartov on my podcast to discuss whether or not genocide is being prosecuted in Gaza, Bartov being a historian of genocide and a colleague of mine at Brown, you can look him up, Bartov, and other such affronts were the reason why the Manhattan Institute decided to cut me loose. And it's true, they had been underwriting. I have a small staff that helps me put out the podcast and the newsletter, and those people have to be paid, and we're still paying them, but not with the help from the Manhattan Institute, which I had seen as, well, that was going to be my think tank affiliation as I transitioned into Emeritus status at Brown and moved away from the academy into the public arena. And I went down to met some of their heavy hitters at the board meetings and stuff like that, and was working my way into the inner sanctum. But I got stymied because of the Gaza stuff. So, don't cry for me. I'm doing okay. But there are consequences. The podcast community that I've built up of subscribers and followers and whatnot, tens of thousands of people, they make their views known. I'm out of here is not an uncommon remark that I see in the comment section sometimes from people, and you follow the numbers at Substack and YouTube, and they go up and they go down, and you have to take that on board. So that's a factor. That's a fact of life. I'm a citizen of the world who is observing what's happening in Gaza and is mortified by it. I am not an expert on the foreign policy and military and so forth issues, and am not interested in becoming one, to be honest with you. But I'm appalled. I'm appalled not only by the deeds being prosecuted, but by the discursive environment here in the United States in which acknowledgement and expression of critical reaction against it is less robust than I would like, or perhaps I should say more compartmentalized, because if you go to certain places, you can hear a lot of criticism of what Israel is doing in Gaza, but if you're just channel flipping on cable news, not so much.
So I think the juxtaposition of the 1990s and this current moment around this question and how it manifests in both of these time periods, right? This kind of problem about self-censorship. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what we should do. And it seems to me that you raise a couple of things that, especially drawing on your disciplinary training as an economist, bringing to bear a cost-benefit analysis and the kinds of calculations that people with unpopular opinions need to employ. You also draw insights from sociolinguistics to frame what you call a theory based on a conception of political communication that stresses strategic considerations. And it seems to me that part of your answer to this problem of how one might attempt to speak truth to power or just truth to stupid under conditions of social pressure to conform is a very carefully, tactically, or strategic series of interventions, right, in communication. And I thought this was really interesting, and this is kind of whatever the topic might be, right, in which self-censorship has become a factor, that it's not about speaking in an authentic voice or speaking from the heart, which you characterize as naive and ineffective, but speaking strategically. And I wonder if you could kind of just, would be curious to hear you say more about that as one way to deal with this problem of self-censorship, whatever the topic might be.
Well, I have the metaphor in the paper, reading between the lines, writing between the lines. And it comes from Leo Strauss' Persecution in the Art of Writing, where he talks about how you read medieval philosophers in light of the fact that they were writing in an environment of political exigency, where to question the church could be lead to a death sentence and whatnot. So you had to read between the lines. So I assume that your evocation of strategic speech, of artful manipulation of the discursive environment in order to get your point across without, plausible deniability would be one of these ideas. I put something out there, but I give myself an out. I'm strategically ambiguous. You're not reading me right. I didn't really mean it the way it sounded, kind of thing. But it's out there now. It's out there. This kind of thing would be one example of that. But I don't think there's enough traction there. I think if you thought the war in Iraq in 2003 was a disastrous error of judgment in foreign policy, there wasn't any way to get that point across without, in effect, saying Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, these guys, George W. Bush, are on the wrong side of history here. This is a mistake. We're cutting our nose to spite our face. We're trashing our own values. We're whatever. I mean, I'm not making that argument. I'm just using this as an example of how it is. I don't think an artful management of the discursive environment where you don't quite say what you mean or you say what you might mean in a way that you can deny having meant it after the fact is good enough. I think you have to go frontally at such things. I mean, I think the environment that we're living in now, with the current presidential administration and with the moment of upswelling of sentiment from the right, if you're concerned about it, if you're concerned about the future of the democracy, now's not the time to mince words. Now's the time to speak at it directly. But I think, there's institutional and then there's personal. So a free press, what's the role of a university? A university is supposed to be a place where people explore the difficult questions in depth with the protections of tenure and other institutional safeguards without having to be accountable to the demos for what it is that they say. So, universities need not to be taken captive by a political apparatus that says, I'll cut your funding if you don't sign off on my agenda. I think that's a terrible development. I don't run a university. I don't have to be responsible to trustees and alumni. I'm not balancing anybody's budget, so it's easy for me to say. But it looks to me like the stakes are enormously high in the preservation of the integrity of these institutions against the incursions that, the barbarians are at the gates here, and they have to be resisted. So there's institutional accountability, but then there's also personal courage. There's the willingness to do what I'm doing. Sorry for how that sounds. But sticking your neck out, in writing that essay, got introduced to and read carefully Václav Havel, the late Czech playwright and politician, essay that he wrote in collaboration with his colleagues in the resistance in Eastern Europe in the late 1970s and early 1980s, called The Power of the Powerless. And he makes a compelling argument there on behalf of the moral imperative of living within the truth and not succumbing to the lie, not being governed by the lie, not surrendering your humanity to go, what does they say, float along with the crowd down the river of pseudo-life. And there's an almost spiritual dimension to this argument. Am I going to allow myself to be put into a box, stymied, stifled, and stunted in my full embrace of my responsibilities as a human being because the party says, because the Stasi say, because the consensus view of respectable opinion requires of me that I bite my tongue? Or am I going to live to the full extent of my potentiality as a reflective and morally responsible human being by speaking such truths as I may be given to know?
Yeah, I mean, I really like the passages on strategic versus naive communication. I mean, I thought that these were really interesting, but ultimately say that it's going to come down to courage, individual will. You write, how then are the demagogues and the haters to be denounced? How can reason gain a voice in the forum? How can truth about our nation, our party, our race, our church come to light when the social forces of conformity and the rhetorical conventions of banality hold sway? How can we have a genuine moral discourse about ambiguous and difficult matters, such as racial inequality in our cities or on our campuses, when the security and comfort of platitudes lie so readily at hand? Although it may violate the communal norms of my economics fraternity to say so, I believe that these things can be achieved only when individuals, first a few and then many, transcend the world of existences by acting not as utilitarian calculators, but rather as fully human and fully moral agents determined at whatever cost to live within the truth. I mean, it's a beautiful bar, but it's an awfully high bar, right? And you say that if not this, right, then the peril is kind of equally intense. You say the risk of self-censorship then is not so much that our public intellectuals and political leaders will be repressed, but that private citizens will be. If we cannot know what our friends, family, neighbors, and community truly think because they fear reprisal, we cannot know ourselves. Social life abhors a discursive vacuum, and where self-censorship imposes diffident silence, true evil can creep in. I mean, right, so the stakes for you in some ways couldn't be higher, right, of us all having the courage to make these choices, to speak, even when we would really rather not, to protect ourselves. I mean, wow, right? I mean, is it plausible? Is it doable? I mean, kind of, do you hold out hope, for our ability, first a few and then many, to kind of rise to this sort of occasion?
It's very romantic to think so, isn't it?
Yes.
I don't know about hope. Maybe faith is a better word. And I love that you love this book so much. Your passages that you've quoted almost bring tears to my eyes because I remember writing them. And I'm happy to see that they've made such an impact on you. There's Havel, someplace else in that essay, says that the struggle here is really about the very possibility of individuality. It's a kind of flowery philosophical idea, but he says, if I'm governed by my reflexive adherence to the strictures the boundaries, the constraints, I'm not really living fully. And, I think this spirit of a determination to stand for the truth as one understands it is at the core, isn't it, of, you know, every kind of revolutionary transformation where people are going against the consensus, but they eventually prevail? Of course, they don't always prevail. Sometimes they get rode over by tanks and shunted into backwaters and financially bankrupted and silenced. So I ramble here. You should save me, Angel.
I will save you. And I will tell you that I really appreciated this book. It was really interesting to me to revisit it, you know, after the span of quite a few years, with a lot more experiences under my belt, a lot more, you know, ways of trying to deal with these questions, both personally and professionally. But I don't come without a criticism, because I really respect you, and I think when you're dealing with someone you respect, you should, you know, kind of feel free to push back a little bit and speak in a critical vein. It feels to me like a time that's nearly impossible to convince young people in particular of the virtues of free speech and encourage around speech, the marketplace of ideas. Not my favorite term, but I know people like it. You know, so it's a moment when we're saying, look, respect free speech and the diversity of thought, but don't badmouth Charlie Kirk on social media. Don't dissent too loudly on Gaza, or we'll dox you or run you through a disciplinary process that you can't possibly win because it's stacked against you. Don't say gay. Specious charges of anti-Semitism brought to bear, right, against law firms and universities. I mean, don't we need stronger and better structural protections of dissent? I mean, isn't part of what's missing here that there's some structural problems that you need to fix? That it can't always just be, you know, the reliance on individuals acting in courage. Are
you talking about the courts, the Supreme Court, the First Amendment? I'm sorry, what structure?
So courts, certainly. Universities, maybe trying to strengthen protections around dissent, you know. Fights on the local level, right? I mean, there are a lot of policies, right, that have been brought to bear that are really kind of, again, I mean, they don't so much stifle free speech, but they do seem to be anti-dissent, right, about what you can and can't do, right? Or like driving into, I mean, there's some states have these, you know, pieces of legislation that allow you to drive into intersections where they're protesters. I mean, you know, there are a lot of structural ways, you know, where, I mean, doesn't that have to be part of a fight to allow more people to have this moment where they're courageous enough to step forward in the political arena and dissent?
Well, I guess that's a political question of how much space the law is going to give to the protection of dissent. And I don't have a well-developed opinion about that one way or the other. I do think, though, that the reaction against the kids on campuses protesting about Gaza has some chilling aspects to it. I'm not sure what institutionally, structurally would be done to, you know, not disruption, not violence, but voice. And that's a matter of concern. But I don't have a well-developed framework in mind on the structural side.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't say that.
What about hate speech?
What about hate speech?
Yeah. I mean, there's a structural thing. I mean, what about...
Do you mean should hate speech actually be...
Yeah.
I mean, it's not illegal, right, to engage in hate speech.
But you mean, should there be ways of sanctioning it?
No, I mean, should there not be ways of
Or should there
sanctioning?
not be ways of sanctioning it? Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to be provocative
Yeah.
here. You want free speech. Well, what about people using the N-word? What about using the F-word and all of that kind of stuff? Should it be foreclosed out of a sense of
Yeah.
protection of the sensibilities of vulnerable communities, or should it be allowed, not encouraged, but allowed in the interest of opening up the discourse to voicing even of unpopular opinion? I'm trying to say that's a hard case.
It's a very hard case, right? I mean, I would like to believe that, you know, the famous line that I might not agree with you, but I would defend your right to speak. You know, that's another hard standard to try and live up to, right? I mean, you know, and in some ways that always strikes me as plausible philosophically, but hard to do in practice in embodied ways with actual people put at actual risk because of actual speech acts, right? I mean, those kinds of questions. Things around which, right, I mean, there just aren't, there aren't 100% right answers, right? Some of the stuff is, you know, really impossible to solve, but imperative that we keep kind of struggling with it, right? Keep trying to figure out what some of these, where would you draw certain kinds of lines? What are certain kinds of propositions okay? Are there things that we should sort of rule out of bounds, especially in an educational context, right, in which it's impossible to learn in a context where you feel as if your humanity isn't supported, right? I mean, so I think that, you know, it's a really rich topic to continue to take up and to talk about and to debate about, and maybe give ourselves a little more courage, you know, in coming forward and being able to contend with each other in those kinds of ways. All of which is to say that, you know, to start to bring this to a close, and we have really talked a long time. I think we might be able to take a question or two if there's something that's really burning from the floor. Yeah. Yep. I don't know if there was someone else over there, but yeah, oh, I'm sorry, it's right here. Is it on? It's about to be on.
Testing.
There you go.
Thank you both for this. It's amazing, informative in all the ways, and I gleaned a lot of wisdom, and so I'm really appreciative for that and of that. I wanted to ask a question related to Fanon, but then we're talking about politics, and we're talking potentially about decensorship and what that looks like in a growing environment. And there's this piece of an age group and how we fit into this. And so, in as few as maybe 3 adjectives to a full-blown explanation, I was curious to hear your thoughts on Candace Owens, and who I believe exemplifies a lot what we're talking about today in a lot of different ways potentially, but also the problematic areas as well too. And so this living like contradiction, right? So I was just curious about your overall thoughts on that, from as little as 3 adjectives maybe to a full-blown explanation.
My thoughts on Candace Owens?
Yes.
You know, not all black conservatives know each other, right? I mean, they don't all know each other, right?
Well, Candace is a very controversial figure, as you know. She is not bound by the conventional constraints on discourse, that's for sure. She's inclined to conspiracy theoretic stuff that it's not my cup of tea. You know, but she's challenging certain constraints that I actually don't mind being challenged. So I'm not going to give an endorsement of Candace Owens here. I have noticed her, that's for sure. But I'm not a devotee.
Maybe one more and we'll. Oh, can we let her? Come on up. Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Loury. Thanks so much for coming. I just finished your memoir today. It was really well written. Sometimes it felt like I was reading a novel.
Thank you.
In chapter 9, you write about a time when a colleague in the University of Michigan economics department privately discouraged you from publishing your essay, Responsibility and Race, and how you were disturbed by his counsel for you not to speak your mind. And I understand it was pretty easy for you to brush off his advice. He was just a colleague and you're a pretty confident guy. But for students who do not make their living in social commentary, how do you think they should respond to authority figures, maybe people who do have more wisdom that maybe might come from age, when they do offer these, politely offer routes of self-censorship?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
How should students respond to people with more wisdom, or maybe people, figures of authority that do offer advice that do advise routes of self-censorship?
Like my colleague offered to me
Yes.
in that early period in my career, that I should I should be careful about the kind of things that I talk about. Well, this is going to sound flippant. They shouldn't listen to such nonsense. They shouldn't allow their sails to be trimmed before they've even, gotten out of the harbor, or whatever the right metaphor is. I have a former student. His name is David Sachs. He's a law student at Stanford now in his third year. He was a classics major at Brown. He came in during his freshman year to my office, and he asked me for advice. He said he felt stymied, that he felt the environment was so closed, he couldn't voice any opinion at all without somebody telling him that he needed to get in line. And he wanted to talk to me because I had established a reputation as being someone who was outspoken and who went against the grain. And do you know, this kid and I ended up in an independent study. I'm answering you by saying, find a different professor. We ended up in an independent study where we went back and we read Plato, and we read John Stuart Mill, and we read John Milton, and we read Alan Bloom, and we read George Orwell. We read Glenn Loury's essay. We made a study out of this whole problematic. That was a semester, developed into a second semester where we created a course, developed into the subsequent 2 years where we offered the course in seminar format to 20 students. And it's one of the most gratifying teaching experiences that I've had in my life. It's been 3 years since David left Brown, and he and I stopped collaborating, and I haven't taught the course since because it somehow wasn't the same without him. But there are other professors. Find them.
Thank you.
That's such a nice note to end on. But before we thank you formally and thank the people in the room, we want to wish the people who've been joining us on live stream a good evening. For those of you in the room, we're going to ask you all to hang out a little bit and talk to each other. Share observations, feedback, other questions that came to mind from this conversation. We're going to ask you to have some refreshments over there. We're going to ask you to visit our Open Inquiry Fair, where we ask people from around campus who've been partnering with us on Open Inquiry Week, as a way of acknowledging the rich history at Michigan when it comes to trying to train students and faculty staff around difficult dialogues across difference, civil discourse. So you can visit the tables, have some conversations with our friends from the library, explore Talking Maize and Blue, which would make a lot of us very happy. We're kind of the new kids on the block in this space.
We also have our friends at Book Suite who are making copies of the book, Self-Censorship, available for purchase, which Professor Loury, well, you could probably get him to sign for you, which would be nice. So I want to make sure you sign my copy. But I do want to thank again our co-sponsors for this, the Talking Maize and Blue Task Force, the Life-Changing Education Theme Year, the Program on Intergroup Relations, Heterodox Academy, the UM Ann Arbor chapter, the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy, the Central Student Government, and of course the Office of the Provost. Let me also do a special thank you for members of my staff in the Provost Office, Debbie Willis, Mary Annette Cano, Kaylee Weiland. There's so many people. Marie Ting have been really enormously dedicated to making this event successful, being able to open up this kind of conversation for us on campus at this moment, and I am so grateful for all of their work. Finally, please join me in thanking Professor Loury for such a great conversation.